I'm Melissa Scanlon. I'm the director of the Environmental Law Center, and you are here attending a speaker series that we host with the library and the Faculty Development Committee. And this particular talk is also sponsored by the New Economy Law Center that Gus, Beth, and I have co-founded here in the Vermont Law School last fall. So normally we wait for about 5 minutes before getting started, but because we're at capacity, we are going to get started because we really can't let very many more people in.
That's it.
Yeah, that's it. Very good. And the structure of this is that we'll have the talk, and then we'll leave time for question and answer. Maybe about a half an hour or so, or 20 minutes for question and answer after the talk. So let me introduce our speaker. We're pleased to welcome Marta Cerrone. She's the Executive Director of the Denali Meadows Institute, and her work focuses on fostering systems thinking for designing sustainable regional economies. Before joining the Institute, which she joined in 2012, she was, for 10 years prior to that, a research professor at the Gund Institute, which is focused on environmental economics. And there she taught and did research on how nature contributes to people's well-being. She's done a fair amount of international consulting with the United Nations Development Program, where she's quantified ecosystem services in monetary terms in order to build capacity for local management of natural assets. And today she is going to be speaking to us about designing the new economies in a time of scarcity. So please join me in welcoming Marta Cerrone.
Well, thank you all for being here on this very weird day, rain and warmth in February, not so hot. Anyway, as I was listening to the presentation that Melissa just did of me, thanks for that, Melissa. I'm just so eager to tell the rest of this story of what I'm interested in right now. So let's delve in a little bit. Well, first of all, I don't know how many of you know the Denali Meadows Institute. We are based in Norwich, Vermont, so not far from here. And again, inspired and motivated in our existence by Denali Meadows, who most of you, I would say, probably know. And but at any rate, to me, she is certainly a pioneer of systems thinking, but going back to the whole idea of how we address the question of what are limits to the expansion of human ways, essentially, on the planet, which is something that I'm going to talk about, so I'm not going to give you too many details. Currently, we have 2 tracks of work, and one is dedicated to cultivating her legacy, her tremendous wealth of works that are available on the web. Free, so we have 1,000 pieces available on our website, denalimeadows.org, so I invite you to visit there. And we also develop learning units. We are increasingly more interested in systems leadership. It doesn't need to be from a systems perspective in business or non-profits and elsewhere. And also we are very keen on the conversation around what a new economy looks like. And we have been collaborating with several of you. Of course, we have here Chris Wood from Bail, dear partner in a lot of the thinking around new economy around here, and Vermont being so rich in experiments and ideas to bring elsewhere as well. So come visit. We are there with an open door policy at all times. Just briefly about me. The accent that you hear is Italian, so I just want to point out sort of the beginnings and where I am right now, right? So what motivated me in environmental sustainability as being, of course, living in the absence of natural capital, but also strange circumstances in the age of excessive extraction, let's say. It was a time when we had actually an oil refinery in the periphery of Milan, that was so close to the downtowns. We were in, actually my family was not exactly downtown, so I was born fairly close to the downtown, but then living in the outskirts. And over there was a naturalized oil refinery called ENI, and one of the biggest ones. And it was spewing fumes every night from the refinement of the oil. And just that smell every single night, having to have our windows very much closed, but I was living in an old house, believe it or not, even in Milan, and so there was a lot of infiltration of bad quality air. So at an early age, that outrage sort of kicked in and motivated me through life. And so, because today I want to talk about limits to an extractive system, but also limits as a narrative, and so in motivations for acting. In my case, motivation came from outrage, and then it changed over time. So we are living and acting in a part of the world, at least in the US here, that is a high sequestering carbon area. So that's a map actually of carbon sequestration. I come from a background of studies in forest ecology. My outrage led me to studying forests and really having a passion for trees. But then over time, I found myself struggling to find the root causes why forests and ecosystems were endangered and depleted. And that's when I landed to ecological economics. So just like, I mean, it's actually very different than environmental economics in the sense that it questions the assumptions of the whole economic system. It just doesn't only try to reorient the thinking, the applications of the economic thinking to the environment. So that's what I meant. So anyway, so we're here, me, you guys, we live in a highly sequestered area for carbon. And so from here, you might even also have the impression that things are fine. And I mean, I know we tend to connect to the rest of the world quite a lot. But at any rate, I'm sure you might have seen this slide before. It comes out of the Resilience Center in Stockholm Resilience Center. And it talks about acceleration. And so the whole idea of essentially a lot of indicators from the socioeconomic side, but also from the ecosystem and earth side of things, they all express this interesting behavior of acceleration. And in systems terms, you can think of acceleration as sort of an exponential growth, or there's some vicious cycle that actually spirals things up. And so what to take away from here, apart from some depression, of course, is that there is something that was actually surprising to the researchers there, was that this acceleration starts around 1950s. So that's the time when that sort of the design conditions of the economic system, or the way of living on this planet, start manifesting themselves in an accelerated way. And so we as humans, in different parts of the planet, in different places of power or understanding of these phenomena, we have been trying to make sense of all of this. And so here I'm fond of this work that tries to capture the evolution of our environmental thinking over time. As we face this acceleration, we more and more realize what that looks like. And so you can see sort of the early days of environmentalism, so nature for itself, elite, white, rich people trying to push to protect these large tracts of land, well motivated, of course, very important, and that is building essentially also the basis of our protected areas in the US. Then that sort of understanding, or actually visibility of the impacts on Earth, that led to actually that sense of understanding in population biology. And that's a little bit also the time of outrage that was talked about, so the 70s and going into that realization of the need to change. Clean Air Act also comes from that period of time. And then also reflecting in part of my trajectory, the 2000s or so, Nature for People. Okay, let's make the case for economic preservation. So there's an economic incentive and economic benefit in protecting species, in managing ecosystems sustainably. And that's where I also landed personally at the Geiger Institute. Let's make the economic case for all of that. And so you put a label, a dollar label on ecosystems that happened in 1997 in Nature. My boss at the time, Bob Costanza, became very famous for that. And personally, I also went away from that. I did a lot of that, but not for the sake of putting a price tag on nature, but more for the sake of the process itself. But I'm coming at a different place, and I think each of us, maybe wherever we are sort of keeping the larger change around us. And I think that's where we are more at this time, where people and nature and understanding the complexity and coming from a system perspective, I think that's very important. So it's not so much about making nature sort of appealing from an economic perspective, but it's going back to the roots of where value is intrinsically in people and in nature. And so, and of course, if you go back to the idea of the acceleration, some of the early people who started thinking about what acceleration means for ecosystems and for humanity, of course, you encounter the whole discussion, the whole narrative of limits, and that's the symbol that you see here. So for today, I just wanted to elaborate a little bit more on the early notion of limits, the physicality of them, the fact that they obviously exist, but also in terms of a narrative, what does that mean and where did that lead us? And so when you start thinking about limits, in a way, it's kind of interesting to see where do we hit the limits, what's causing the limits, and what's causing the limits to expansion in our system is essentially this common sense of sustainability. So basic house rules, essentially, like renewable resources must be used at or below the rate at which they regenerate themselves. And out of this, bear with me, it's all common sense, but it doesn't mean that that really helped in the whole process of designing a sustainable economy. So here, I have examples from deforestation in Northern in New England and Brazil. Of course, not much time to let the soil regenerate there or the forest. Another way we hit limits is, if we don't start adopting renewables at the speed or at the rate faster than non-renewables are used. So here, example of Indian women carrying charcoal and Maasai women actually spreading the solar technology. And of course, the pollution aspect, pollution cannot exceed the rates at which pollution can be absorbed or mitigated by ecosystems of the atmosphere. This is Lake Champlain, for example. There's a whole question around, of course, also legally and in terms of new limits from the EPA. And so this is something that is really in the front page and in the front of our mind all the time here in Vermont. If you layer these sort of basic rules of living on the planet with the principle that actually these renewables and non-renewables should also be shared fairly. So those are sort of the portfolio of the house rules for living on our planet. And that's where you start hitting the limits. And then, of course, you must be familiar with the planetary boundaries idea. And again, from also a narrative perspective, here it's an attempt to try to conceptualize the extent of the impacts. And each slice here is a slice that represents an impact on a given area. So, for example, we have biodiversity loss, being off the map essentially, and it just struck me. This statistics are actually that basically humans and their raised animals occupy 90%, 95% of the whole biomass of the planet, which is kind of mind-boggling if you think about it. Of course, the counterfact of that is a major resource loss. So anyway, here, I'm not going into the details, but the idea is that the green zone is sort of the safe zone for a lot of these different variables, and of course, beyond that, it becomes an uncertain zone, and the big question of that we are oftentimes busy with it and worried with is that of what does it mean to go off a safe zone of the planet. And so, again, this is a way of conceptualizing, of trying to understand, making sense of the accident impact. And equally similar, the so-called Oxfam's donut, where you actually add a layer of the social limits to the extractive system that we have. And I'm not, again, going into details because I wanted to show examples of how to sort of portray this idea of the larger impacts. And to me, these are concepts that are helpful. I don't know if you find them helpful, but at the same time, they don't have explanatory power. They don't analyze the root causes of why we have these overshoots. And also, they are rear mirror measures, so they cannot really help you much in terms of envisioning possibilities. But it's nevertheless a good way to picture the multidimensionality of these issues. I didn't want to scare you, but this is the World 3 model. And I want to go back to this, because this was in the 70s, the early 70s. And so it was the first time that at a time of growth, at a time of prosperity, at a time of non-questioning limits in any way, but certainly at a time of, visible signs of distress in ecosystems for the ones who don't pay attention. So there was the MIT group led by Jay Forrester and Dennis Meadows and Vanilla Meadows, Jürgen Randers and Bill Behrens and others, who then started modeling actually from a system perspective with more explicatory power than, for example, the indicators or the conceptualization that I showed. They started questioning this idea of, okay, what does it mean to expand exponentially in a finite world? And so they picked 6 variables that range from population, food, mineral extraction, industrial output, services, and they started essentially modeling based on the current level, the current data that they had, projecting them into the future in a model that was never heard before. Because it was a model that had such a level of complexity in the assumptions as well. And so non-linear processes were part of that, thresholds, vicious cycles or reinforcing feedback loops. So it was something unprecedented. And their main result, not that I want to spend too much on this, but there's some sort of very robust features of the model that still are relevant today. So you have on your left the standard run, and bear with me, there's only a couple or 3 curves that I'm going to mention so that you're not overwhelmed. And by the way, all the little letters that you see, those are all also curves, but you shouldn't necessarily worry about those. So D stands for depth, B stands for girth, and all that. So anyway, what's important here is that we have 200 years, right? So from 1900 to 2100. And essentially, what the main result was, if we continued business as usual, would have been an initial peaking of industrial output and food. Around, I guess, probably around 2020, 2030, that's the initial prediction. The reason why they didn't put, details, dates, was that they didn't want this model to be predictive. Far from that, to want this to be something that they were, held, entrusted in mechanical form in terms of predictions. So essentially, the main result, without going into the details here, was that because of scarcity, because of this major deficiency in resources, you can see, I don't have to point here, but resources are here essentially. There is this huge drop, and essentially is the manifestation of a world that is scarce. And so when scarcity hits, then basically extracting new resources from depleted soils to non-renewable being taken out the ground, everything becomes more expensive, and more capital then is allocated to extracting these resources or compensating for the loss, for example, soil fertility, to the point that industrial output is suffering and the food system is suffering to end. With a delay later on, you see a peak in population and collapse. And so essentially, the standard run was around this idea that between 2020 and 2030, you would see a slowdown in the economy that would later on, given delays in the system, lead to a collapse in population. And so that you can imagine at the time, and we probably do know actually, you might remember what the reaction was. And actually, Chris and I showed a film that talks about that history, exactly what happened to the authors after the backlash they received. And so that's an example of a narrative that found people in such denial and so unprepared to receive that inconvenient truth, indeed, probably the first one of many. And so that message then, after being sort of critiqued, and I even learned that some of the most prominent economists compiled entire reports against this report. So like 130 pages of, and most of that was actually interesting because it was not based necessarily on the science. So it was based more on that sort of a gut reaction, because at the time the science was not developed enough to really do a full critique. So at any rate, so the man became famous for doom and gloom, and he was forgotten essentially for 40 years. But one part of the story that is not told is actually that there was a stabilized world possibility. But before I get to that, I should say that the standard run was tested against different scenarios, including a scenario of high tech. So what if we have basically limitless resources, we use clean technologies, we recycle 75%, the most amazing technological improvements you could imagine. What does that do to this model? And that would push overshoot and collapse to later on, like 20 or 30 years later, that would still happen. So overshoot and collapse sort of became known as that very robust feature that even if you try extreme changes, the model produces still the same behavior, except the stabilized world, where the assumptions were that population, actually the families would start family planning. It would be a 2-children policy, and it would be reconstruction of soil. You can imagine this was not so much into excessive technology, but is implementing policies that make total sense. And so essentially they were able to simulate this one scenario of stabilization, but this one was never discussed. So in terms of narratives, this was left behind and forgotten, although here were some interesting hints at how actually to manage this runaway growth. Interestingly enough, a few years ago, Graham Turner wanted to go back to industry growth and just retest where we were, retest the assumptions, and overlay new data, essentially. And so in the gray part is this historical data set the industry growth team used. And in orange, you find, so this here are the new data in orange, the observed data, so added. And we have then different scenarios. One scenario is the business as usual, so the standard run, which is, let me see which color, yeah, it's the light green here. And then stabilized world, we have with the squares, and then you have the comprehensive technology, the scenario I mentioned. So what happens here? So with population, it seems like we are tracking pretty well the business as usual or standard, and we don't know about the comprehensive technology. And here notice that actually the author took the time to put the dates in, so actually it's pretty clear. And so population, you're seeing food per capita we are, it seems, above the standard run, but certainly not the stabilized world. With the idea in the stabilized world, we would have more food for all, essentially, and certainly not close to progressive technology. What's interesting is industrial output per capita, in which we are staying fairly close also to the standard run. And again, I don't want to go too much into detail, but it's kind of interesting that we are following the standard run in some way. And so that's sort of a call for alarm, of course. But what's interesting to me is that robustness that shows up all the time. So what does it mean for us as we start thinking about designing alternative economies with this notion that the system has a pull towards these dynamics? And so one other reason why it leads to growth and this type of thinking and modeling has become interesting is the current debate about how do we actually stabilize the climate in a way that also enables some level to grow. And so is that possible at all? So you probably have read a lot, the New York Times, Paul Krugman, big debates in terms of using actually climate change as an economic opportunity. The climate summit happened, the climate economy summit happened in Randolph College a few days ago. So at any rate, so that's a big question that comes back at this very time. Is that even possible to decouple growth from emissions? And so, I don't know, that would be an interesting discussion with you all, but so there is definitely that idea out there that yes, it is possible to decouple growth and emissions, and so that's more like the, I guess, technical optimist in a way. And I found some interesting data actually from the European Commission showing for 2014 in the report, like a cumulative analysis of emissions, GDP, and also greenhouse gas emissions intensity. So in blue, you see that GDP basically went up. But at the same time, you saw that emissions went a little bit down. And so in this case, so now that I want to go into the data necessarily, but so what's interesting is that a lot of the debate has been around whether this decoupling is real or is not. So sometimes, you could have economic growth that shoots up, and then you have emissions that increase, but not as fast as GDP. So then some people also call that as a decoupling, but in reality, emissions in total still increase. So in this case, there is a certain level of decoupling that is observed. But the question is, and I get to the question, and so here what you see is a simplification of, in a way, that vision. How can we achieve that through technology in a way that is sustainable and compatible with growth? And that's where I was going. So the question is, yes, can we do that? Yes, but the amount of decoupling that is necessary is actually so enormous in some ways that actually this transition will require some deep transformation, part of which will include a desirable reduction in growth and contraction of the economy. So that's sort of a dichotomy that I don't know if you find in your even your studies, your activism, your work. It's something that has affected me profoundly in terms of, and I see that all the time. And so, according to this worldview, then again, another depiction is more like the eco-communalism, and these are actually, by the way, resources from the Green Transition Initiative at the Talos Institute, and they did a great job actually at sort of imagining different possibilities. Yes, I'll be done soon. So, at any rate, so that's one way that this discussion on the limits has come back in this current discussion. And then, of course, so if that's a way that actually can allow us to go through a transition, a way that mentioned in the second case, yes, what do we need to do actually to transform more deeply, more systemically the system? And that's a question that, of course, is being posed in many ways, and certainly more and more frequently on the streets. And so one thing that I wanted to mention today that is very helpful to me in understanding whether we are designing economies that have leverage, that solutions that have the possibility of transforming a system, then I go back to the framework of the leverage points that Donella Meadows developed in 1999. And so, how many people are familiar with this type of work? So, and first of all, the article is available online for sure. But the whole idea here is that instead of going through a whole discussion on systems, Donella provided us with a little bit of a shortcut. After years and years of modeling systems, starting from the 70s, as I mentioned, and beyond, she was able to distill, pills of knowledge around where to intervene in systems to cause the most impact, where you can shift one thing and that shift causes many other things to change. And so she had the idea of 12. I'm very sorry about this. This has never happened. So, let's see if that works. So, at any rate, I'm glad actually, by the way, that this is a very welcoming audience. It inspired me being anxious, etc. So, anyway, so there were these ideas around 12 vector points that had essentially had a hierarchy to them. So there are places that have more power than others, and vector points are always places of power. And so they didn't have to read them all. So they range from tweaking at the margin with weights and numbers of parameters to actually, thinking completely different. Some of them are more related to the characteristics of systems and how they behave. Some other ones are really so high level that I wanted to focus on them. And these are these last ones. Information flows, rules, self-organization of systems, goals, but also mindsets and paradigms, and transcendently all of those, all of the above. And so the question that I'm posing here to you, to myself, as I look at solutions that are emerging around, because we are all eagerly looking for the solutions, is which ones have the most power to transform systems. And so I started looking at the perspective of looking at some ideas or some solutions around goals. And so Donella thought that whenever you tweak with the goal of the system, basically what it's designed to achieve, and it's not so much the stated goal of the system, but it's actually what the system produces in behavior because of how it's designed. And so you could say, well, what is the goal of an economy? You could come up with many answers. We want jobs, we want to meet basic needs. We want many things out of the economy. But if you observe clearly the behavior of the current economic system, it is designed to grow. So therefore, the goal of the economy is the result of that behavior, growth. And so with that in mind, I just wanted to share a little bit about the genuine progress indicator, which is a response to that, to the idea of what is the goal of the economy. And so, yes, whenever you talk about goals, of course, you encounter indicators. And so if we want the economy to grow, well, we measure growth, right? So GDP is a measure of growth, has been criticized in many ways. I'm not going to go into that whole literature discussion. But in 2012, Vermont passed a law for measuring economic well-being differently. And there are 20 other states that are examining this idea. and it's being tested and applied elsewhere. Maryland was actually the first state that started adopting a general progress indicator, although it was Governor Martin O'Malley who wanted it, and it was never legislated for. And therefore, we're not sure what's going to happen to the GPI in Maryland. So in Vermont is the only state at the moment that actually has it as a law. And so that, and the Guide Institute is doing the work to collect data every year and raising the fact. And so what's interesting about the General Progress Indicator is that, well, first of all, it distinguishes between what growth is good for people and what isn't. And also it includes things that GDP completely ignores, like the value of volunteering work or solidarity. From an economic perspective, it's very interesting because it's the only indicator out there that actually includes income inequality. Does it make a difference if more people have opportunities or only a small elite? And so you can see here that income inequality goes by 29% in Vermont from 1970 to 2010. And Vermont has some of the fastest growing land prices in the whole of the US. So what it essentially does, it starts from similar to the GDP, it starts with personal consumption, and then it adds or subtracts things that are beneficial or not beneficial. And so you can see that, for example, environmental costs are included the cost of climate change, the cost of losing farmland and soil, and anyway, so this gives you also an idea of the answer to the question. So maybe we have to ask the question: what can grow and what shouldn't grow in an economy? And oftentimes, ecological economists are pretty vague. Sometimes you hear this narrative of growth, no growth, but then there's nothing in between, and there's not enough nuance to really understand. And so I think GPI, besides being a tool for thinking differently about the economy, also answers that question: what can grow and what shouldn't grow? If you look over a few decades here, of course GPI at some point stops growing and GDP continues on, and the gap, of course, is kind of sometimes a very, it's a sort of a dry chart, but that gap between GPI and GDP is actually the overshoot. It's the cost that we inflict to people not being able to afford services and education, etc., but also planet and ecosystems really depleted. So that's an example of how, one thing I need to mention is that these costs and benefits are calculated monetarily. So that's a good application of that environmental economics kind of accounting that we were talking about, especially as part of my earlier work. And so we were talking GPI as a response to the question, what is the goal of an economy? From a corporate perspective, again, goals, having different goals and a set of different goals is very important. And benefit corporations are an institution, a structure that actually enables alternative goals. And so, how many people are familiar with benefit corporations? I say majority of you. Yes. And so, that's interesting because through that structure, you allow actually the pursuit of different goals other than profit, of course. And I checked when some of the states approved legislation to allow benefit corporations, and most of them were actually last year. I think the last one was Tennessee in January, Vermont in 2011, so Maryland in 2010. So there's been a whole swarm actually of legislative work around this. And so, of course, if you layer the structure with an ownership structure, like of worker ownership, that even empowers these rules and the goals even stronger, more strongly. I would go into the importance of self-organization. So systems, you achieve a lot of power and change when you allow systems to reorganize themselves. and be adaptive and be inventive around institutions, for example. And so self-organization is a quality of systems that makes them more powerful, as you can imagine. And so oftentimes when I think, the first image I have thinking of self-organization, first in this case, is the time when we had Irene and communities got together and entire new streams of funding were created and collaborations that were not possible before. As an example of self-organization, the power of that in systems is the power of networks. And so that's one of the most uplifting examples of states and communities working towards a shared vision of achieving 50% of food produced regionally by 2060, and that's the New England Food Vision. And I'm glad that Vermont Farm to Plate is actually a partner in this initiative. And so actually the different partnerships around food are talking to one another in New England and planning together. And again, in Vermont, so the power of networks. So these are structured and governance mechanisms that didn't exist before, but in this region, actually, Vermont, I think, is particularly attuned to this way of working, but never before, I think we have fully blown networks working on the food system, and reinventing it, and creating jobs at the same time, but then having this idea of soil to soil. So, for example, Vermont Farm to Plate is a network we started with 30 members. They had farmers, lenders, bankers, distributors, legislators, so individuals and organizations represented at the table that had a shared agenda, shared vision, shared metrics, going back to metrics. And also had a backbone organization like Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund that was allowing this to happen. They had working groups. They started with 30 members, and they have more than 300 members at the moment. And so it's a good example of how a systems view actually, in fact, they did a systems map of the food system before they decided which working groups to focus on. The energy field works similarly with the Energy Action Network in Vermont, and they also did a systems map, and they also have working groups and highlighting lever points that they decided to work on. And very lately, so I mentioned the work that Vermont Council on Rural Development is doing around the Vermont climate economy, and that's a big question mark, but because it's emerging now, and it could be the seed of a new network that actually integrates the existing ones around making Vermont a special place for actually devising a climate-safe economy. What does it mean to invest in alternative businesses? Technology, yes, with the renewables, but also the replenishing of the soil and in connection with the forestry player as well. So that's an interesting emerging, I would say, community for sure. It's not yet shaped as a network. It could, so that would be, it's something to watch, so something to keep on your horizon. And what was very actually interesting to me is that the word growth was never used. I read the whole report and I attended their summit at the beginning of this week. And so, but instead development was used with the idea of actually not having the growth mantra constantly there. And regarding development, that would be judged and evaluated using the gender progress indicator, so alternative measures. So I'm pretty hopeful, and I want to share that as a possible network or supra network forming there. Getting to my towards the end of the presentation, and so rules and information flows. So of course, places of power are also new rules that you set in the system and new information flows that you create. So I was just thinking that one important rule that is emerging in terms of carbon pricing and carbon tax, of course, This is a map actually worldwide of where there is action going either to emission trading schemes or to actual carbon taxes. This comes from the worldwide. Again, not in much detail, but to give you a sense that there's a big chunk of the world that actually is interested in exploring this idea. But what spoke to me lately was this idea that 6 oil companies actually wrote to Christiana Figueres at United Nations to demand a carbon price. And that was at the time of COP21 in Paris. And at the same time that this was happening, we learned that ExxonMobil was lying egregiously about the internal findings of climate change that they had. And so, again, from a systems perspective, it's interesting that one group of big polluters is asking for a carbon price, and then another one is trying to mystify and sort of hide information flows that were essential. So information flows are key systems, clean and functioning, and they're essential from that perspective. I just wanted to mention that, of course, the role of business is essential here in some of these rules, and I just learned that not only Ben & Jerry has their own have their own internal carbon accounting and carbon pricing, but also they were joined by Seventh Generation. So that's a case where sort of business is ahead of legislation in that case, or policy. And an extension of that, how many people have heard of the Vermont's Common Assets Fund? So that's an idea that is a few years old. There was a bill that was presented, I can't remember when it was 2011, 2010, and it's been sort of sitting somewhere and waiting to be resuscitated, I think. But this idea of, again, it extends, the idea of pricing is actually taxing use of ecosystems and the surplus that is generated in the economy. It dates back to the idea of everybody being born with a right to a share of ecosystem wealth, essentially. And Peter Barnes is actually one of the key proponents of this idea. And essentially, you would charge for the use of nature services, and you would create a trust fund in perpetuity. And it would function a little bit like the royalties, the oil royalties in Alaska. And so 75% of these funds would be used for ecosystem restoration and renewables. And part of that, of the whole fund, 25% would be actually shared as dividends. So it would be your Earth citizens' dividends. And that gets us closer to a little bit the sort of basis of power, like mindsets and worldviews. Because that, first of all, creates the notion of being entitled by right, by being alive, by being a human being on this planet, to this share. And that's a concept that it's totally anti-mainstream. And people get a check, of course. This is actually my dear friend, Gary Flomnoff, who did the calculations at the Garden Institute. And at this point, so at the level of, so nothing has more power than changing your worldview or your way of thinking about something. And Donella mentions that even more powerful than that is recognizing that you can transcend your worldviews and your mindsets. And so that sort of an awareness of what you actually think and you actually believe, so that you don't identify necessarily 100% with your ideas. And so that she places first in terms of the most impactful way, which is, we've been talking a lot with Chris, is the transformational approach, right? Cultivating that awareness at a deeper level as individuals, and how do you bring that awareness into the teams, the groups that you work with, and eventually design the structures or like networks that you saw, based out of that cultivation of how you transcend paradigms. So I was lucky to be in Paris during the second week of the climate talks, And this was a message that I'll never forget. So I was hanging out with a lot of artists over there. They tried to change the climate narrative. And to me, this slogan and this expression is very transformational. So we are not fighting for nature, we are nature fighting itself. And so you can think of ways to look at nature. You could start identifying the villains in the system, the ones who exploit nature, or the ones opposite of that are the ones who actually are caregivers and take care of nature. But what if we are nature and we actually remember and go, and we don't have to reinvent ourselves as destroyers or caretakers, but we actually remember who we are. And I just want to leave you with that. And we started on time, so we have a limit.
We do. So we'll just open it up to questions, and why don't you raise your hand if you have a question, and Marta can call on your turn.
Financing. How do you create the money to transition to this new economy, and do carbon offsets play a role in that?
So the money question is interesting because it has different levels. And one level is, well, we need slow money. Slow money not as the organization, but we need to slow money down in terms of that's a big driver. And so that's sort of at the system level that would achieve a lot. So having economies that have a stabilized throughput, but also have money that doesn't grow so exponentially and create that bubble out there that is out of tune with the reality of the working economy. So that's one answer. The other one, there are many innovative ways to finance renewables. I mean, this idea of the trust fund, the common assets, is of course out there. And it's of course so revolutionary in a way that is not even debated at the moment. But the carbon tax is a similar idea of creating a fund. But in reality, there are so many interesting ways that, for example, Energy Action Network is devising with involving the role of utility companies, and creating, even net positive returns from installing, for example, renewables on your roof right away because you have affordable capital to do that from utility companies, for example. I'm just setting one example, but there's a ton that is being discussed. In fact, what was interesting to me, because I'm part of the capital mobilization group with the Energy Action Network, and apparently there's no lack of money at the moment in Vermont for making the big transition with renewables, but the demand is not yet there. And so increasing the demand and understanding how these different solutions work together to come to a coherent package that someone with a overworked life doesn't have to go crazy to implement. So there are other barriers, but it seems that that's solvable. Questions or comments?
Yeah, I have a question about the systems thinking part of it, and a lot of times you talk about what we can do and we can intervene, but we're not at the top of the system. So
you mean like
it's a question of framing? Yeah, it's a question of how do you what's the granularity that you're looking at? So I sort of tend to view things more from a thermodynamic perspective, and so when that energy is there, we burn it, and so we let little molecules run all over, and you go to Paris, and everyone I talk to, talks about these things, but they really don't actually reduce their consumption. They don't actually want to not have children. They don't actually want to stop traveling. They want everything to kind of go along, but we'll just come up with different sort of excuses or rationales to keep going with this. And this is the idea of the question this gentleman was saying. Well, how can we finance it? well, there won't be financing in our future without her. There just won't. I mean, you just won't have money that works the way it works now. So it's a question of are we in control, and why do we convince ourselves that we have this control?
Yeah, that is a good question.
Does that make sense? I know I might have to ramble a little bit in now, but
Yeah, so it seems that certainly there is, I can see.
as though it's a machine with dials that we can somehow turn the dial on ourselves, and I don't know if that's possible.
Yeah, so, my answer could be quite extreme.
Yeah, that's okay. For me, that's okay.
I think, if you guys read This Changes Everything by Naomi Klein, she has a wonderful introduction about denial.
And she went and had a child.
And so she
went and had a child so that we would give her hope.
right.
So you know what I'm saying? So there's something maybe we can't control our psychology.
So, but to me, that initial introduction that she portrays denial in such a relatable way that you could recognize yourself looking away, or not wanting to feel the pain, or some other ways. So at any rate, I actually had the experience of being with a powerful group of systems thinkers last year. And we had an evening of discussions and fun. And one activity that was proposed by one of the participants was to declare the day of your death. We would go in circle, and each of us would pick a day. We different ages and stuff, and we would just say when that would be. And you can imagine the fire in the room. There were people from all over the world. There were Russians who refused. Like, no, I'm sorry.
That's really interesting.
I should say that the lady who did who proposed this exercise was American, one of the few Americans there, and she had worked a lot with leadership development and whatnot. So at any rate, the reason why we did that exercise was like, okay, if we don't face our own mortality and we are in denial, by the very nature of being human, how can we actually face the crisis out there and take action if we don't get to that point of authenticity? So, despite the fact that people were shocked and not particularly amused by the whole thing, so she struck a chord. And the next day, she had a few people coming to her and actually wanted to talk about that stuff. So, at any rate, so one thing is, okay, how do you, get to that denial and the very deep level of authenticity within us? And also, I think it's just an important skill. One thing I can say is like, Donella, after writing that report, was highly scientific and all, but then, they came out with a second report 20 years later, and a third report 30 years later. And the results were all the same. And at some point they said, no, enough, we're not going to do that again. And so what she resorted to was actually to focus on the human qualities that enable the sustainable transition. And for her, those qualities were listening, learning, and being humble, loving, and networking, connecting with others. So in the end, she even gave up a tenured position in Dartmouth. She stayed a lecturer for all the rest of her life because she wanted to have time to write, because she thought that writing columns, weekly columns, for example, for writing news but syndicated throughout the nation, would have more power to reach people's hearts in, exactly playing with those terms. And so, but then, go back to your question, at the higher scale, I think the transition is from what I can do, what can I do, to we, and sort of who else cares about this? Who else is good at this and can help it? And so the networking becomes what is my next level of engagement beyond what I do at home. And many of us are so motivated that sometimes it becomes like almost a religion or a philosophy, and you don't even talk about it anymore. And yes, you wear sweaters. Yes, it becomes that's not going to make a difference altogether. Even if we all did it, it's not going to make a difference. But it's like our individual daily ritual that keeps us true to the cause, I think. I don't know how you guys see it.
I think that we all lose sight of the point, and I think that's incorrect, but the small changes actually do make a big difference. We all can make a difference. The thing is, we're all sitting here talking on this large scale, like what is the main problem, but each community has its own problems and difficulties, and so I think that instead of trying to have this blanket statement like this is the problem, this is what, how we can solve it. We just have to look within ourselves and our community, address the problem there, come together and make changes, and that's where change starts and begins. And so we can do it. The power is in our hands. We're relying on the wrong system. So it's place-based solutions.
Yeah, and just quickly as a reaction, also the idea that climate emissions and technology, they become so confined, right? And what about, everything else, like species out there and food, and
It creates a ripple effect.
So we'll go to you and
So when you,
Sorry.
you go ahead.
I don't know who you're pointing at.
it's just, I'm sorry, the reasoning.
Chaya. Yeah, so when you talk about goals, I thought of them as sustainable development goals because all of them, like the 17 goals that we have out now, define them clearly. And when you talked about the GPI, so is it based on the Canadian model?
So the Canadian Index of Wellbeing?
Yes.
Unfortunately not, because that's my favorite set of indicators, which, unlike the GPI that was developed by a group of experts and then sort of forced into public policy, etc., that was developed bottom up, and so communities.
And GPI is bottoms, like downwards up approach?
The GPI is more like expert-based, and versus Canadian Index of Wellbeing in terms of the process how that was developed. Also, the Canadian Index of Wellbeing is it looks at increases and decreases as percentages, so it doesn't do any monetary calculations. So some of the indicators overlap, but they trace the delta, the differential. Yeah.
So, what do you think is the need right now to study behavioral implications to adjust it in the final decision making or the policy making, or maybe economic behavioral impacts on individuals?
Yeah, that is. I think that's super important. That's my answer. I mean, but then understand. I would say that I would not be satisfied by just understanding. Once you understand things, yes, it helps. But then, how do you actually make the transformation from understanding intellectually and publishing papers about it, versus actually, bringing the skills that I was mentioning before, into your work environment, into the planning? How do you talk about these soft things with policymakers? So that would be very interesting. I would translate that academic level understanding. And we had you in pink.
So I've recently, in the last few years, become aware of this thing, you can Google it, the One Earth calculator, trying to live like your water usage, gas, fuel, all the resources as if there were only one Earth instead of like you had the resources of 30 Earths for you personally to pull on. I've been looking at co-housing, and there's quite a variety there. I've been down to Cog Hill, and it's quite an interesting journey to look at all the places that think they're co-housing. And yeah,
I'm there too.
I think that's kind of a brainwashing in some cases, but
You mean, I'm sorry, so you're making a comment on your experience with co-housing communities and being a little bit like greenwashing? I didn't understand that part.
so I think of co-housing should be more like the sharing economy, and reduce consumption in the way of like, every house doesn't need to have its own washer and dryer.
Sure.
That sort of thing. And if the one washing dryer does break, everybody's going to chip in to fix it instead of everyone having their own washing dryer. Well, I've got the money to fix mine, too bad that yours broke and you can't afford to fix yours. It's part of the mindset, too.
No, I
I don't know if that's going to stray from what you're trying to say, but I just bring it back to there's a lot more of people at the grassroots level, if you think in terms of a pyramid, than there are people at the very top. And so actually, if every individual can think in terms of the one earth and things like that and modify their life changes, whether they choose not to eat meat fat because of animals, but just the consumption of water and so forth. You can
sorry to interrupt, but I'm very fond of those tools, and they work for some people. Unfortunately not for all. So, but yeah, you provide good visions of sharing, and we were based at Cocktail, by the way. So, and who else do we have? So we had here comment.
Yes, about the GPI. How is it being used now? And are there any examples of it actually getting some traction and driving decision making?
Yeah, so I think probably the most advanced work was done in Maryland, and because there was actually a good group of people who could translate, the indicator level narrative to, what does it mean for budgeting and for policies. And so there are examples in Maryland. So for example, new policies bills being proposed, and then you would have like a GPI card. What would this do to the GPI? How would, so every time that there's maybe a budgeting question, a budgeting decision, then you would see the counterpart for the GPI. And if it's good for the GPI, it's good for all, and then the people supporting, so it was a tool to add transparency and true costing within the policy discussion. And here in Vermont, we don't have that liaison between. So what we have is an academic institution that is keeping the data and releasing the reports, but not doing too much publicity and outreach. And then there's the Agency of Commerce and Community Development that actually is tracking, also using the GPI in their own planning. So it was part of the comprehensive economic development plan, the first one that developed. But I just met with the gentleman who is supervising that work at the agency, and he was complaining that we don't have that liaison here in Vermont. Someone who's a champion and tries to work with legislators and the budgeting offices. So that's we're a little bit behind. But so far it has had a sort of an awareness raising type of effect, and it has started to make some, it has some impact in budgeting, but not as extensively as you want to see. And personally, I've been struggling with how to make it more interesting and so that people would be, or communities for the matter. But again, going back to the question behind, so I actually like the Canadian model much better because it was bottom up and people got energized as a way to measure real progress within their communities the way they wanted it. And so if depending on your target audience, you choose. I don't think the GPI is super effective to engaging people.
Let's see, I'm aware of one kind of interesting model that helps network people who are trying to live according to different standards. And I wonder whether, and I'll say what it is in a second, but my question is whether there are other, whether it could be extended much more broadly to help get to where we need to get for some of these levers. So, for example, animal agriculture, reducing the amount of beef that people eat, which would have a big effect on greenhouse gas emissions. The interesting model that I came across was something called part-time carnivores, which is kind of big in the UK and Australia, barely exists here. And you can elect to, withhold from animal products, 1 day a week or 7 days a week, and you go online and it affects your carbon footprint. And so I learned about that, and I became the 28th member in the U.S. And I asked, how can I connect with other people? And they said, we don't reveal that, but the most effective way is to have teams and make it fun, and there are a lot of young people, they have t-shirts, whatever. So the idea is that, like you were talking about, it's community-based, it's bottom-up, and yet it's connected to other teams all around your country and the world. So you feel like there's a momentum, or you feel like there's support, or maybe it's like whatever that B corporation kind of thing was, which I'm not familiar with. But so I guess my question is, do you know of things within our country that help people feel connected in their efforts and in their principle changing, like she was talking about? So you don't just feel
so
like,
you feel that you're part of something bigger.
Yeah.
It used to be that the Center for New American Dream had campaigns like that, so that if you're boycotting flying, you would team up with that, as what we were saying, so you actually start feeling a little bit more of an impact. I don't know if they're still doing it, but I thought that's a remarkable effort there.
Yeah.
And because I totally agree, sometimes you just feel powerless otherwise.
We're going to need to